The fire that changed the world. The story of Hiroshima and the dawn of the atomic age, it began with light. Not the gentle dawn that stirs life into being, but a light so fierce that the sky itself seemed to scream. For a fraction of a second, night turned to day over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The air caught fire. Shadows were burned into stone. People vanished, leaving behind only outlines scorched into the walls. The birth of a new age announced itself in a blinding flash, the age of atomic fire. What humanity unleashed that morning was not merely a weapon. It was the power of creation itself, the same power that fuels the stars, that burns in the heart of the sun, now brought down to earth and shaped by human hands. On that day, August 6, 1945, mankind became both creator and destroyer. When President Harry S. Truman addressed the world from aboard the cruiser USS Augusta on his return from the Potsdam Conference, his words were calm, almost bureaucratic. A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. To the public, it sounded like another step in a long and bitter war. But for those who understood the science behind it, the statement carried the weight of the unimaginable. The force from which the sun draws his power has been loosed against those who brought war to the far East. Those were Truman's words, a declaration not just of victory, but of transformation. The bomb was presented as retribution for Pearl Harbor, as a means to end the war swiftly and save lives. Yet beneath the rhetoric was something darker, the quiet realization that humanity had crossed an invisible threshold and could never go back. The weapon that ended the war would also end innocence. For centuries, man had dreamed of wielding ultimate power, the philosopher's stone, the divine spark, the fire of the gods. But only in the 20th century did science make that myth real. When nuclear fission was discovered in 1938 by German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, and explained by physicist Lise Meitner, the implications rippled across the world. The nucleus of the atom, once thought indivisible, could be split. And in that splitting lay energy beyond imagination. Physicist Niels Bohr once warned, "This new knowledge will either end war or end humanity." But in 1945, that choice had not yet been made. By the time the atomic bomb was complete, the world had already been at war for 6 years. Cities burned nightly across Europe. Millions had died in the snow of Russia, in the jungles of Asia, and on the beaches of the Pacific. Humanity had already learned how to kill on an industrial scale. Gas chambers, firebombs, mass graves. The atomic bomb was simply the next inevitable step in that grim evolution. But unlike every weapon before it, this one would not just destroy armies or fortresses. It would destroy everything. Matter itself torn apart, life evaporated in an instant. And now, that power sat in the belly of a silver bomber waiting on a Pacific Island runway. The date was August 6, 1945. The island of Tinian, in the northern Marianas, was alive with the rumble of engines and the metallic rhythm of preparation. Floodlights washed over the vast airfield, throwing long shadows across rows of B-29 Super Fortress bombers. Among them sat a single aircraft that would change history, the Enola Gay. Named after the pilot's mother, the Enola Gay gleamed under the humid tropical night. Inside its bomb bay rested a weapon codenamed Little Boy, 10 feet long, weighing over 9,000 pounds, a dense cylinder of metal and uranium. The crew of 11 men moved with quiet precision. They had been briefed on the mission, though most did not know the full scope of what they were carrying. For them, it was another dangerous but necessary operation, one that might finally end a war that had consumed the world. Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, the mission commander, was just 30 years old. Calm, confident, and methodical, he had been chosen for his ability to keep his composure under unimaginable pressure. Beside him was Captain William Deke Parsons, the Navy ordnance expert who would arm the bomb in mid-flight to avoid any accidental detonation on the runway. Major Thomas Ferriby, the bombardier, would aim the weapon using the Norden bomb sight, the most advanced targeting system ever built. Each man had a role, and each knew that history would remember their names. At 2:45 a.m., the final clearance was given. Tibbets pushed the throttles forward, and the four Wright R-3350 engines screamed to life. The bomber rumbled down the runway, overloaded with its deadly cargo, the wheels leaving the ground only in the final seconds. As it lifted into the night sky, a few ground crewmen saluted, some in awe, some in fear, as the aircraft disappeared over the dark Pacific. Heading north toward Japan, the flight would last 4.5 hours. The Enola Gay climbed steadily to 31,000 feet, its engines humming a steady rhythm. Below, the vast emptiness of the Pacific stretched out like an endless void. Inside the plane, conversation was sparse. The crew performed their checks, monitored instruments, and tried not to think too much about what they carried. Tibbets later said, "We knew it was going to be a big explosion. We didn't know what it would do." At 3 a.m., over the Marianas, the sky was clear and still. A second B-29, the Great Artiste, flew behind, equipped with sensors to measure the blast. Another, necessary evil, carried cameras to document the event. Far ahead, 3 weather reconnaissance planes scouted potential targets. The primary was Hiroshima, chosen for its military importance, the headquarters of Japan's Second Army, a port, a center of industry, and because it had not yet been bombed. The untouched city would make the effects unmistakable. The secondary targets were Kokura and Nagasaki. But fate and the weather would soon decide which city would live and which would die. For now, Hiroshima slept. At dawn, the people of Hiroshima awoke to another day of war. The year 1945 had been hard. Shortages of food, air raid drills, endless propaganda promising victory that no one still believed. But that morning, the air was strangely peaceful. The sirens sounded briefly around 7 a.m. when radar detected incoming aircraft, but the alert was cancelled. Only 3 planes, no sign of a large raid. Locals assumed it was reconnaissance. The all-clear signal was given. Trams rattled along the streets. Children walked to school. Workers filled the factories. The sky was blue, cloudless, and quiet. At 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima was alive with the normal sounds of morning, conversation. Bicycle bells, the whistle of a distant train. 43 seconds later, there would be silence. As the Enola Gay approached its target, Major Farabee adjusted the Norden bomb sight, aligning the crosshairs on a distinctive T-shaped bridge, the Ioi Bridge. Near the city center, bomb doors open, Tibbets ordered. In the bomb bay, the weapon hung motionless in the open air, its metal casing gleaming. Inside, uranium was divided into 2 subcritical masses, harmless until the moment they were forced together by a carefully timed explosion. At 8:15 a.m., Farabee released the bomb. Little boy dropped away, falling through the clear morning sky. The aircraft lurched upward, relieved of its weight. For 43 seconds, the bomb fell in silence, accelerating to nearly 600 miles per hour. Below, the people of Hiroshima looked up, some pointing, curious, others unaware. No one ran. They had no reason to. At an altitude of 1,900 feet, the firing mechanism triggered. In less than a millisecond, a chain reaction began. Neutrons split uranium atoms, releasing more neutrons, which split more atoms. A runaway reaction that multiplied faster than the mind could comprehend. In that instant, 15,000 tons of TNT worth of energy erupted in a single blinding flash. Witnesses miles away said the sky turned white. Others saw a sphere of fire expanding outward, a miniature sun consuming everything it touched. Within a second, the temperature at the hypocenter reached 4,000 degrees Celsius, 7,200 degrees Celsius. Buildings vaporized. Human skin burned off before the mind could register pain. Those directly beneath the blast simply ceased to exist. A fraction of a second later, a shockwave slammed outward at more than 1,000 kilometers per hour, tearing through the city. Houses collapsed like paper. The pressure crushed lungs and shattered glass miles away. Then came the firestorm, hurricane-force winds feeding flames that devoured everything still standing. Within minutes, Hiroshima had become an inferno. At 31,000 feet, the Enola Gay banked sharply to avoid the blast. Even at that altitude, the shockwave rocked the plane violently. The men turned back to look where Hiroshima had been. A column of smoke and fire rose into the sky, a mushroom cloud towering more than 40,000 feet high. Navigator Theodore Dutch Van Kirk recalled, "It was like watching the sun rise inside the earth. The city below had vanished. What remained was a vast, boiling wasteland." In the words of one survivor, Hiroshima was no longer a city. It was a flat, burning desert. Tibbets later said, "I looked down, and I could see the city disappearing. I didn't feel any remorse. I just felt that we had accomplished our mission." But for those on the ground, the mission meant the end of the world. Back in Washington, Truman's announcement celebrated scientific triumph.
He called it the greatest achievement of organized science in history. The bomb was framed as justice for Pearl Harbor,
as a necessary blow to end the bloodshed. Yet, for all its rationalization, there was something inhuman about the event, a detachment that only the distance of thousands of miles could allow. In that moment, the United States held a power no nation had ever wielded before. For the first time in history, humanity had the means to destroy itself. The atomic bomb was not only a military weapon, it was a moral revelation, a mirror held up to civilization. It proved what was possible, but it also forced the world to ask what should be done with such possibility. The sun had risen again over the Pacific by the time the Enola Gay returned to Tinian. The crew was greeted as heroes. Tibbets was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Truman's telegram congratulated them on a job well done. No one spoke of what they had seen below. There were no screams, no faces, no bodies, only smoke and silence. But in that silence, a new world had been born. The same atom that held together the fabric of the universe had been split open, releasing its secret, and mankind had used it first for destruction. The bomb that fell on Hiroshima was more than the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new era, an era defined not by victory, but by responsibility. An era in which the power of the sun could be held in human hands, and the question that would haunt generations: what kind of hands are they? Before the atomic fire illuminated the skies of Hiroshima, the world was already burning. The 1930s had been a decade of despair and ambition. Empires, humiliated and hungry after the First World War, turned to new ideologies: fascism, militarism, conquest. Germany sought revenge. Italy sought glory. Japan sought an empire of its own. The Great Depression had shattered economies. In the vacuum, strongmen rose with promises of rebirth. Hitler in Berlin, Mussolini in Rome. And in Tokyo, generals who dreamed of a Japanese destiny stretching across Asia and the Pacific. Japan called it Hakko Ichiu, 8 corners of the world under one roof. It was the vision of a divine empire, blessed by the emperor himself, destined to rule Asia. But destiny, as history has shown, often demands blood. By 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria, seizing its vast lands and rich resources. The League of Nations condemned the move, but no one stopped it. The world was weary, paralyzed by economic collapse. Japan learned a dangerous lesson, that the world's outrage was nothing compared to its inaction. In 1937, Japan's army swept into China, capturing city after city in a campaign of conquest and terror. In Nanking, they unleashed 6 weeks of slaughter, tens of thousands of civilians murdered, women violated, streets soaked in blood. The world watched in horror, but again did nothing. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler rearmed Germany, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, and the Spanish Civil War became a testing ground for new weapons. The old order of peace and diplomacy was crumbling. By the late 1930s, the globe was splitting into 2 realities, one of fragile democracies trying to hold on to ideals, and another of totalitarian regimes driven by ideology and empire. The fuse of global war had already been lit. Japan's empire expanded relentlessly. It needed oil, rubber, and steel, the lifeblood of war, and these resources lay beyond its islands. The generals looked south toward Southeast Asia, then under Western colonial control, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, French Indochina, and the Philippines. To the Japanese military, the Western powers were both obstacle and insult. They saw themselves as Asia's rightful leader, freeing the region from European domination. But in truth, their conquests replaced one master with another. By 1940, Japan had formally joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact, creating the Axis powers. As Nazi armies rolled through Europe, Japan seized the moment. With France defeated and Britain struggling for survival, the Asian colonies seemed ripe for the taking. But one nation stood in the way, the United States. For decades, America had watched Japan's expansion with growing alarm. The United States held territories across the Pacific, Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, and prided itself on being the region's dominant power. Japan's rise threatened that balance. American diplomats urged Japan to withdraw from China. Japan refused. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt imposed economic sanctions, first restricting exports of metals, then aviation fuel, and finally, in 1941, cutting off all oil shipments. It was a devastating blow. Japan imported 80% of its oil from the U.S. Without it, its Navy and Air Force would grind to a halt within months. Tokyo faced a fateful choice: submit to American pressure or seize the oil it needed by force. In secret meetings, Japan's War Council debated invasion plans for Southeast Asia, but they knew such an attack would bring the U.S. into the war. The solution, they decided, was to strike first and strike hard, to cripple America before it could fight back. The plan was bold, almost suicidal in its ambition. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, designed an operation that defied military tradition: a surprise aerial assault on the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Yamamoto knew the risks. He had studied in the United States and understood its industrial might. "If I am told to fight," he warned, "I shall run wild for 6 months. But after that, I have no expectation of success." Still, duty was duty. The die was cast. It was a quiet Sunday morning on the island of Oahu. The tropical air was warm, the sky a pale blue streaked with thin clouds. American sailors slept in their bunks, families prepared for church. The Pacific lay calm, a deceptive peace. Far to the north, over the dark ocean, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers plowed through the waves. On their decks waited 353 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, their engines ticking as mechanics made final checks. At 6 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fuchida raised his hand and shouted, "Tenkai-sei!" "Take off." The first wave roared into the sky, sunlight glinting off wings painted with the red circle of the rising sun. The pilots flew low, guided by radio silence and the stars. Ahead lay Pearl Harbor, the heart of America's Pacific defense. At 7:02 a.m., on the Hawaiian Islands' northern tip, 2 young radar operators saw a massive blip approaching. They reported it, but their superior dismissed it as a flight of B-17 bombers expected from California. The warning went unheeded. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs fell. The attack came with terrifying precision. Torpedoes ripped through the calm harbor waters, slamming into battleships anchored neatly in rows. The USS Arizona exploded in a fireball that split the ship in 2. The Oklahoma capsized within minutes. Men leapt into burning oil slicks, their uniforms on fire. Japanese planes screamed overhead, strafing runways and airfields. The roar of engines mixed with the shriek of sirens and the thunder of anti-aircraft guns. Smoke blotted out the morning sun. In less than 2 hours, 8 battleships were damaged or sunk. 2,403 Americans were killed. Another 1,078 were wounded. The Pacific Fleet, once a symbol of American strength, now lay twisted and burning. At 8:10 a.m., as the Arizona detonated, a single sailor wrote in his diary, "Hell has come to Pearl Harbor." When the sun set on that Sunday, the United States was no longer at peace. The illusion of isolation, that the oceans could protect America from the world's chaos, was gone forever. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice, grave but unshaken, echoed through radios across the nation. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. Congress responded with near-unanimous fury. Within hours, America declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The Second World War had truly become global. Across the country, young men lined up to enlist. Factories that once built cars now forged tanks, planes, and bombs. Women filled the assembly lines. The sleeping giant Yamamoto had feared was awake, and it was angry. The war in the Pacific became a brutal contest of endurance. Japan struck swiftly, taking the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore. Their empire expanded like wildfire across the map. For months, the Allies reeled from defeat. The Japanese soldier fought with fanatic discipline, convinced of his emperor's divine mission. Prisoners were executed or sent on death marches. Civilians suffered under occupation, but by 1942, the tide began to turn. In June, at the Battle of Midway, American codebreakers deciphered Japanese plans, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to ambush the enemy fleet. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were sunk in a single battle. Japan had lost its naval superiority forever. The war had shifted. From that point on, the Japanese Empire would fight not for conquest, but for survival. The Pacific Campaign was unlike anything seen in Europe. There were no front lines, only islands, each one a fortress, each one a slaughterhouse. On Guadalcanal, Marines battled for months in sweltering jungles where disease killed as many as bullets. On Iwo Jima, Japanese soldiers dug into tunnels and caves, refusing to surrender. On Okinawa, civilians leapt from cliffs rather than face capture. Both sides fought with a ferocity born of hatred and fear. To the Americans, Japan's refusal to surrender was barbaric. To the Japanese, surrender was shame worse than death. Each victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands dead for a few square miles of rock. By 1945, as the Allies closed in on the Japanese homeland, the cost of invasion loomed large in American minds. Military planners warned that an assault on Japan itself could result in over 1 million Allied casualties and perhaps 10 million Japanese dead. And so, even as the bloodiest battles raged, another kind of war was being fought. One not on the front lines, but in secret laboratories across America. A war of science, a race to control the atom. Long before Pearl Harbor, in 1939, a group of European scientists had fled the shadow of Nazi Germany. Among them were men like Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and Enrico Fermi, brilliant minds who had unlocked the secrets of the atom and feared that Hitler's Germany might do the same. In August 1939, Einstein and Szilard wrote a letter to President Roosevelt, warning that uranium could be used to create an extremely powerful bomb. The message was clear. If the Nazis got it first, they could dominate the world. Roosevelt responded by launching a secret research effort, a project that would grow into the Manhattan Project, the largest scientific enterprise in human history. While American soldiers battled across the Pacific, in hidden desert laboratories, physicists and engineers worked tirelessly to harness the energy of the atom, a quest to build a weapon of unimaginable power before the enemy did. The road to Hiroshima, in truth, began not in Japan or the Pacific, but in those laboratories where theory met fear. And science became the servant of war. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. Hitler was dead. Europe lay in ruins. But in the Pacific, Japan fought on. Cities burned nightly under American firebombs. Yet the emperor's government refused surrender. Even in defeat, Japan's leaders spoke of honorable extinction. President Roosevelt, the man who had guided America through depression and war, would not live to see its end. On April 12, 1945, he died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage. The presidency fell to his quiet, untested vice president, Harry S. Truman. When Truman took office, he knew nothing of the atomic project. Within weeks, he was told of a bomb so powerful it could destroy an entire city in a single strike. He listened in silence. Then he whispered, "This will be the most terrible thing ever discovered." Outside his window, the world was still at war. Inside his mind, the decision that would define the next century had begun to form. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood alone, Cities reduced to ash, its navy destroyed, its armies surrounded. Yet no surrender came. The invasion of the Japanese home islands was scheduled for November. But now, in the New Mexico desert, another sun was about to rise, a man-made one. The story that began at Pearl Harbor was about to end in Hiroshima. From the smoke of battleships would come the light of a new world, not of victory or peace, but of revelation and reckoning. The age of total war had become the age of total power, and the hands that had built weapons of fire were now ready to grasp the fire of the universe itself. In the beginning, it was only an idea, an impossible whisper passed between frightened men in a world gone mad. The year was 1939. In Europe, Hitler's armies were marching across borders like floodwaters breaching a dam. In Germany's laboratories, physicists worked under the Nazi flag, experimenting with a new and terrifying discovery, the splitting of the atom. Among the refugees who fled Hitler's Europe were scientists who understood better than anyone what that discovery could mean. They were men of logic and precision, yet they carried with them a growing dread that the laws of physics they had unlocked could become the foundation of a weapon beyond imagination. They knew what uranium could do, and they feared that in the hands of tyranny, it could remake the world in fire. Two of those men, Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, sat together one afternoon in the summer of 1939 in a small house on Long Island. They drafted a letter, polite, cautious, almost bureaucratic in tone, but beneath its academic phrasing it trembled with urgency. The letter warned President Franklin D. Roosevelt that Germany might be developing extremely powerful bombs of a new type. It spoke of a chain reaction that could release vast amounts of energy, perhaps enough to destroy an entire city. They urged the United States to act before it was too late. Roosevelt read the letter and frowned. "What you're saying is that this new bomb could blow up a whole city?" Szilard nodded. The president's answer was brief. "We'd better make sure the Nazis don't get it first." With that single sentence, the most secret and expensive scientific undertaking in human history was born, the Manhattan Project. At what began as a handful of scientists in borrowed university labs soon expanded into a sprawling network of cities, factories and mines. By 1942, the United States had mobilized not just soldiers but physicists, chemists, mathematicians, engineers, an army of intellect. The project's headquarters were placed under the command of General Leslie R. Groves, a man known for his efficiency and his temper, the same officer who had overseen the construction of the Pentagon. Groves was not a scientist. He was a builder, a manager, a man who got things done, and above all, he was a man who kept secrets. For his chief scientist, Groves chose a theoretical physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer. Thin, sharp-featured, intense, Oppenheimer was a man of contradictions, poetic and brilliant, arrogant yet uncertain, fluent in Sanskrit and haunted by philosophy. He quoted ancient texts as easily as he discussed quantum theory. To his peers, he seemed almost otherworldly, a man standing halfway between genius and myth. To Groves, he was indispensable. He was the only one, Groves later said, who seemed to know how to lead other scientists. Together, these two men, the soldier and the scholar, built a secret city in the New Mexican desert, far from prying eyes. Its name was Los Alamos. In 1943, convoys of trucks began climbing the dirt roads that led into the barren mesas north of Santa Fe. On board were families, furniture, blackboards, typewriters, and crates of laboratory equipment. The site had once been a boys' school, but within months it was transformed into a self-contained fortress of science, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by military police. No one was allowed to say what they were doing there. Letters home were censored. Mail came addressed only to P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Inside the fences, some of the most brilliant minds on Earth wrestled with equations that could change the future. Men like Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, and Richard Feynman walked the dusty streets, arguing about neutrons and critical mass, while coyotes howled in the distance. Their task was simple to describe but almost impossible to achieve: to build a bomb that could release the energy hidden inside the atom. 3 parallel efforts unfolded across America. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a massive industrial complex was built to separate uranium isotopes, a process so complicated it consumed more electricity than the entire city of New York. At Hanford, Washington, reactors churned out plutonium, a new element discovered only a few years earlier. And at Los Alamos, under Oppenheimer's direction, scientists struggled to design a weapon that could turn these materials into controlled catastrophe. The problem was not merely technical. It was moral. Many of the scientists knew why they were working. They believed they were racing against time, that somewhere in Europe, Nazi physicists might already be on the verge of creating their own atomic bomb. But as the war dragged on and Germany began to crumble, doubt crept in. Was this weapon still necessary? Was it too late to stop it? And if it could be built, should it be used? Oppenheimer's notebooks were filled not only with calculations, but with lines from ancient texts. One he returned to often came from the Bhagavad Gita, a sacred Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He underlined the phrase. It would come to define him. By 1944, the Manhattan Project employed more than 125,000 people across 30 sites in the United States, Canada, and Britain. Its budget exceeded $2 billion, more than any other scientific effort in history. Yet only a few dozen people truly understood what it was all for. Secrecy was absolute. Even Vice President Truman, who would later authorize the bomb's use, was kept unaware of its existence until he became president. As the months passed, success and failure came in equal measure. Reactors broke down, experiments fizzled, calculations went wrong. Some scientists believed the project might never work. Others feared it might work too well. At one point, there was genuine concern that the first test might ignite the Earth's atmosphere, setting the sky itself on fire. The probability is nearly zero, Fermi said. But nearly is not zero. Finally, after years of labor and secrecy, after countless nights spent wrestling with the invisible, the bomb was ready to be tested. The chosen site was a remote stretch of desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico, a place of red sand and silence, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The test was given a code name drawn from one of John Donne's metaphysical poems, Trinity. On the night of July 15, 1945, the desert filled with movement. Trucks and jeeps crawled across the sand, headlights covered, soldiers stringing cables and setting up cameras. Scientists huddled in bunkers miles away, adjusting instruments and arguing about last-minute details. The bomb itself, a bulbous steel sphere known as the Gadget, was hoisted to the top of a 100-foot tower, its wiring checked and rechecked. No one knew exactly what would happen when it detonated. Some whispered prayers, others made bets. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, the countdown began. Oppenheimer stood in the control bunker, hands in his pockets, staring through a narrow slit at the distant tower. The final seconds ticked away, then came the flash. For an instant, night turned to day. The desert was lit with a brilliance beyond description, white, pure, merciless. A wave of heat rolled across the sand, followed by a shock that rippled through the ground like thunder from the center of the earth. The tower, the cables, the very soil beneath it, all vanished into light. A few seconds later came the sound, a low, rolling roar that grew into a fury. The fireball expanded upward, forming a vast, boiling column that twisted into a mushroom of dust and flame. The men watched in awe, some shouting, some silent. One scientist, Kenneth Bainbridge, turned to Oppenheimer and said, "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer said nothing. In his mind, the words from the Gita returned once more. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." When the blast subsided, a crater nearly half a mile wide smoldered in the desert floor. The sand had melted into a greenish glass, later called trinitite, a permanent scar left by humanity's first encounter with its own power of annihilation. Back in Washington, President Truman was informed that the test had succeeded. A single bomb, he was told, could destroy an entire city. The scientists called it a new force of nature. The generals called it victory. The politicians called it leverage, but not everyone celebrated. Some of the physicists began circulating a petition urging the president to demonstrate the bomb's power to the world before using it against civilians. Others argued that such hesitation would only prolong the war. The Japanese government had refused to surrender despite months of relentless bombing. Every day the conflict continued. More soldiers and civilians died. The atomic bomb, they believed, might end it at once. Truman was a man of decisions, not doubts. He had inherited a war he did not start and a weapon he did not ask for. Now both were his responsibility. "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world," he wrote in his diary. "It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era, after Noah and his fabulous ark." In early August 1945, he gave the order, the first atomic bomb, the weapon born in secrecy, tested in the desert, blessed by no god, would be used against Japan. The target would be a city that had so far escaped destruction, one whose geography would allow scientists to measure the full effect of the blast. Its name was Hiroshima. At Los Alamos, Oppenheimer gathered his team and read the message from Washington. The war would soon end. The weapon would be used. Some cheered, some wept, some simply sat in silence. The scientist who had built the bomb now realized he had built something that could not be unbuilt. In the following days, the components of the weapon were loaded onto trucks and flown to the Pacific. On the island of Tinian, under blinding sun and constant secrecy, technicians assembled the bomb, a 10-foot-long cylinder of steel and uranium weighing over 9,000 pounds. The crew who would deliver it trained without knowing what it was. They were told only that it might change the course of history, and it did. In the end, the Manhattan Project was not just a triumph of science or strategy. It was a revelation, a glimpse of humanity's dual nature. In the same breath, it proved our genius and our madness. It showed that in our relentless pursuit of knowledge, we could reach the power of the stars, and that we might also fall by it. As the scientists of Los Alamos watched the last crates loaded onto waiting aircraft, a strange silence settled over the desert they had called home. Their work was done. The world was about to change. None of them knew exactly how, but somewhere deep inside, they all understood one truth that would echo through the coming century. The age of discovery had ended. The age of consequence had begun. When the flash faded over the New Mexican desert, silence followed. The scientists who had spent years chasing equations now stared at the rising mushroom of fire and dust, their faces lit by the glow of something both magnificent and monstrous. In the control bunker, J. Robert Oppenheimer's mind reached back to the ancient Sanskrit words he had studied long ago. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The desert wind carried the echo of that line across the stillness. Mingling with the smell of ozone and scorched sand, they had done it. The impossible had become real. News of the test, codenamed Trinity, traveled swiftly to Washington. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's sudden death only 3 months earlier, received the message in his cramped quarters at Potsdam, Germany, where he was meeting with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. The note was brief, clinical, almost cold. The experiment was successful beyond expectations. But behind those words was the truth. A single bomb now had the power to destroy a city. Truman read the report twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. The world, he knew, had changed forever. By late July 1945, Germany was already defeated. Hitler was dead. The camps had been liberated. But Japan continued to fight on, its cities burning under conventional firebombing, its military leadership vowing to resist until the last man. The planned invasion, codenamed Operation Downfall, was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and perhaps millions of Japanese. The atomic bomb offered something different, a way to end the war swiftly, decisively, and without another invasion. Yet no one truly understood what swiftly would mean, or what decisively would cost. Inside the White House, Truman's advisors debated in long, tense meetings. Some urged him to use the bomb immediately, arguing that every day of delay meant more American deaths. Others hesitated, suggesting a demonstration. an explosion on an uninhabited island to show Japan and the world what awaited them if they did not surrender. Scientists at the University of Chicago even drafted a petition pleading for restraint, warning that the first use of this weapon against civilians would stain humanity forever. But the War Cabinet was unmoved. The Japanese had ignored every demand for surrender. The atomic bomb, they believed, was the final message that could not be ignored. Truman's own reasoning was simple and chilling in its clarity. "We have used it," he wrote in his diary, "to shorten the agony of war, to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans." Yet he also understood the burden of the choice. He was the first man in history to decide when and where an entire city would vanish. On July 25th, he approved the order. The new weapon would be used as soon as weather permits after August 3, 1945. The Target Committee had chosen several cities: Kyoto, Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki, all largely untouched by previous bombings, making them perfect test cases to measure the bomb's effects. Kyoto was spared after Secretary of War Henry Stimson intervened. He had honeymooned there and considered it too beautiful, too sacred to destroy. The final target was Hiroshima, a military hub surrounded by civilian life, a city of bridges and rivers that glimmered under the summer sun. At dawn on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from the island of Tinian in the Pacific. Inside its bomb bay hung a 10-foot cylinder of polished steel and uranium, nicknamed Little Boy. The crew had trained for weeks, but only a few knew what kind of weapon they carried. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the pilot, flew in silence, his hands steady on the controls. Below them, the sea turned gold in the morning light. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb's bay doors opened. Little Boy dropped away, tumbling through the clear air for 43 seconds before exploding 900 feet above the city. In that instant, Hiroshima ceased to exist. A blinding white light consumed the streets, the buildings, the people. The temperature at the center of the blast reached millions of degrees. Shadows of men, women, and bicycles were burned into concrete walls. Rivers boiled. Glass melted. Within seconds, 70,000 people were dead. Tens of thousands more staggered through the ruins, their clothes turned to ash, their skin hanging in ribbons. They had no word for what had happened, only Picadon, the flash, and the boom. In Washington, the news was greeted with restrained triumph. "We have just dropped a bomb," Truman announced. "That is the greatest thing in history." The statement framed it as a necessary act, a scientific milestone, a victory. But in the corridors of Los Alamos, where the scientists read the reports, the mood was far from victorious. Some celebrated, others wept. Oppenheimer walked through the compound, silent, his face drawn. "The physicists have known sin," he would say later. 3 days after Hiroshima, Japan still did not surrender. Some in the Imperial Cabinet argued that the Americans could not possibly have more than one bomb, but they were wrong. On August 9th, another B-29 took off carrying Fat Man, a plutonium bomb more complex and more powerful than the first. The intended target was Kokura, but heavy clouds forced the crew to divert to their secondary site, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb fell through the mist and detonated over the city's industrial valley. The explosion flattened entire districts, ignited 1,000 fires, and killed another 40,000 people instantly. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito convened his council. For the first time, he spoke directly, his voice calm but final. "The time has come," he said, "to bear the unbearable." On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War was over. Across the Pacific, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang. Soldiers embraced strangers in the streets. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years had ended in a single week. Yet amid the joy, a shadow lingered. Photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to surface, cities reduced to wastelands, survivors wandering among the ashes. Doctors reported strange burns, sickness, hair loss, symptoms of radiation no one yet understood. The victory began to feel hollow, haunted. When Oppenheimer visited the White House later that year, Truman received him with a smile. "You think the Japanese appreciated it?" he joked. Oppenheimer did not answer. After a pause, he said softly, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman's smile vanished. He turned to his aides afterward and muttered, "Don't bring that crybaby in here again." The world that emerged from those ashes was not the same. The atomic bomb ended one war but began another, a war of nerves, secrets, and fear that would stretch across decades. Nations raced to build their own weapons, to master the same terrible power. Children learned to hide under desks. Scientists learned to measure morality in megatons. And somewhere, in a quiet desert where the sand had turned to glass, the wind still whispered through the ruins of a tower long gone, carrying with it the memory of the moment humanity first became capable of ending itself. The war was over, but peace did not return as expected. It arrived like smoke, thin, unsettled, impossible to hold. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ruins, their streets littered with twisted steel, melted glass, and the quiet cries of those who had survived. From the blackened soil, a strange white ash drifted upward, settling on the ruins like snow. In the weeks that followed, people began to die again, not from fire or collapse, but from something invisible. Hair fell out in clumps, skin blistered without flame, and fevers rose that no doctor could treat. The survivors called it the atomic sickness. For them, the war had not ended. It had merely changed its form. In Washington, the photographs began to arrive. The president looked at them in silence, his fingers pressed against his chin. He had achieved victory, but the images showed something beyond victory, something for which no medals could be given. The bomb had fulfilled its purpose, but it had also opened a door that could never again be closed. The United States now held a weapon so powerful that it defined the very limits of human destruction. Truman called it a deterrent. Others called it a curse. For the scientists who had built it, the aftermath was unbearable. Los Alamos, once alive with urgency and invention, now felt hollow. The fences remained, but the purpose had drained away. Men who had once calculated neutron flux and fission yield now sat in their offices staring at the desert. Some resigned quietly. Others stayed and tried to justify what they had done by saying the bomb had saved lives. But even those words began to ring hollow as the reports from Japan continued. "We thought we were saving the world," one physicist said years later. "We only proved we could destroy it." Oppenheimer himself became a haunted figure. He had won, yet he felt defeated. When the news of Japan's surrender reached Los Alamos, others cheered, but he stood apart, his face drawn, his eyes far away. He had led the greatest scientific triumph in history, yet he could not escape its shadow. In the months that followed, he became an unwilling celebrity, interviewed by newspapers, summoned to Washington, praised and congratulated by men who did not understand what he had unleashed. At a ceremony after the war, when President Truman decorated him, Oppenheimer barely smiled. Later, he confessed to a friend, "I can't look at my hands without seeing blood." Still, the world moved on, as it always does. Reconstruction began. Soldiers came home. Nations redrew their maps. But beneath the surface, something new was growing, a tension born not of armies or borders, but of fear. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, now watched with suspicion. They had spies in Los Alamos, silent shadows who had carried the secrets of the bomb across the ocean even before it was tested. By 1949, the Soviets detonated their own atomic weapon, and the illusion of American monopoly vanished overnight. The balance of power became a balance of terror. Politicians called it deterrence, but ordinary people called it what it was, a race toward destruction. Cities built bomb shelters. Schools ran drills where children ducked under desks as sirens wailed. Newspapers printed diagrams of mushroom clouds. A single wrong decision, one misread signal, could end civilization in an afternoon. For Oppenheimer, this was the nightmare realized. He had hoped that the bomb, terrible as it was, might make war itself obsolete. That humanity, faced with its own annihilation, would finally learn restraint. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had given nations a new language of threat. He spoke out against the creation of even more powerful weapons, warning that another leap in destructive power, the hydrogen bomb, would not save humanity, but doom it. "The physicists have known sin," he said, "and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." That stance made him enemies. The same government that had once called him a hero began to see him as a liability. The Cold War thrived on certainty and loyalty, not doubt. In 1954, Oppenheimer was summoned before a security hearing, accused of communist sympathies, disloyalty, and moral weakness. The hearing room was filled with reporters, politicians, and former colleagues who now avoided his eyes. The man who had given America its most powerful weapon was now treated as a threat to it. The hearing dragged on for weeks. Every letter, every friendship, every comment he had ever made was examined. They asked him about his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, about his political beliefs, even about his personal life. He answered calmly, sometimes sharply, sometimes with silence. At one point he looked at his accusers and said, "When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you've had your technical success." It was both confession and indictment, the pure honesty of a scientist confronting the moral chaos of his own creation. When the verdict came, it was inevitable. His security clearance was revoked. He was stripped of his influence, his access, and his position. He walked out of the hearing room into the glare of camera flashes, a man both famous and finished. In that moment, the United States turned its back on the father of the atomic bomb. Yet even in exile, he remained a symbol. To some, he was a martyr of conscience. To others, a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellect without allegiance. He spent the rest of his life lecturing, writing, and reflecting, the prophet of a new age he could no longer control. When he visited the bombed-out ruins of Hiroshima in photographs, he saw not triumph, but prophecy. "We built it," he once said, "because we could." Meanwhile, the arms race only accelerated. America tested hydrogen bombs in the Pacific, explosions that dwarfed Hiroshima into memory. The Soviets followed with their own. Both sides amassed arsenals large enough to destroy the world many times over. The power that had once belonged to a single desert tower in New Mexico now lived in hundreds of silos, submarines, and airplanes. The age of secrets had become the age of fear, and yet for all its terror, the bomb also reshaped human thought. It forced philosophers, politicians, and ordinary people to confront questions that had no answers. Could civilization survive its own genius? Could humanity learn to control a power greater than itself? The atomic age was not just a new chapter of history. It was a new kind of history, one where knowledge itself could kill. In his final years, Oppenheimer stood often by the sea near his home in Princeton, watching the horizon. The waves came and went, endless and indifferent as they had long before his time. When he spoke to young physicists, he did not talk of equations or theories, but of responsibility. "The world," he told them quietly, "is not given to us in pieces to do with as we will." When he died in 1967, the wind over Los Alamos still carried the ghosts of his creation. The desert that had once burned with the light of a false dawn was silent again. But beneath that silence lay the truth of his life, that genius and guilt can be born in the same moment, and that some discoveries, once made, can never be undone. The world that emerged from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not the same one that had entered the war. The old certainties of victory and defeat no longer applied. Nations could rebuild their cities, but they could not rebuild innocence. The atomic bomb had redrawn the boundaries of human power and human fear. Every skyline, every border, every political alliance was now shadowed by the possibility of absolute destruction. In the years that followed, the world divided itself in two. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies, became mirrors of one another, each armed with enough nuclear fire to erase the planet. Their weapons were no longer built for use but for existence, for deterrence, for the illusion of safety. They called it mutually assured destruction. Behind that phrase lay a simple truth. Peace was now maintained by the threat of annihilation. Missile silos were buried beneath farmlands. Submarines carrying warheads slipped silently beneath the oceans. Cities practiced evacuation drills that everyone knew would be useless. Presidents and premiers spoke of strength and stability, but in quiet moments, even they must have known how fragile it all was, a balance built on fear, on the steady hum of machines that could end civilization in less time than it took to speak a sentence. In Hiroshima, however, life returned. The rubble was cleared, the rivers dredged, and the ashes swept away. Families built new homes over the foundations of the old. Children were born who would never know the flash that had once turned the sky white. The oleander bloomed again, defiantly, beautifully, in the cracks of scorched earth. It became the city's symbol, a living reminder that even in the shadow of the bomb, life could not be silenced. Each August, the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki gathered to remember. At dawn, they released lanterns onto the rivers, thousands of soft lights drifting through the dark, each one carrying a name, a memory, a prayer. The sound of bells filled the air as the lanterns floated away, flickering like stars across the water. It was a quiet act, but in that quiet was defiance, a refusal to forget, a vow that what had happened once must never happen again. The survivors, known as Hibakusha, carried the memory of that morning in their bodies. Many lived with scars that never healed, illnesses that appeared years later, and the heavy knowledge that they had seen something beyond comprehension. They became the conscience of a new world, living witnesses to the cost of unchecked power. When they spoke, their words were not of vengeance but of warning. "We are not your enemies," one woman said at a memorial. "We are your future, if you do not learn." And yet, humanity continued to live beneath the bomb's shadow. The 1950s brought more tests. Bikini Atoll, Nevada, Semipalatinsk, islands and deserts turned into laboratories of fire. Each explosion drew applause from the government that ordered it and silence from the people who watched it rise. Even as the clouds dispersed, invisible particles settled on the wind, drifting across oceans and continents. The planet itself was becoming a witness. Artists and poets began to speak where politicians could not. Films showed the sky burning. Novels described worlds after the end. Children grew up learning words like fallout, radiation, and shelter. The atomic age was not only a political reality, but a psychological one. It reshaped the human imagination. The bomb had not just destroyed cities. It had entered the collective dream of humanity. By the 1960s, protest movements began to rise. Scientists who had once worked on the Manhattan Project signed petitions for disarmament. Students marched through cities carrying banners that read, "Ban the bomb." Religious leaders, philosophers, and ordinary citizens began to speak the same truth. Survival was no longer guaranteed by power, but by restraint. Treaties were signed, inspections were promised. Yet in secret, nations continued to build. Oppenheimer's words, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," echoed through every era that followed. They were quoted by presidents, written in textbooks and whispered in lecture halls. Few lines had ever carried so much sorrow. For many, they were not merely a reflection on the past, but a warning to the future, a reminder that the boundary between progress and ruin is perilously thin. Decades passed, and technology advanced. The bombs grew smaller, faster, and more precise, yet the danger remained the same. One miscommunication, one malfunction, one moment of pride, and everything could vanish. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came within a breath of that reality. For 13 days, humanity stood on the brink, staring into the abyss it had created. When the standoff ended, it felt less like victory and more like survival. In the late 20th century, the superpowers began to talk of arms reduction. Missiles were dismantled, warheads decommissioned, silos sealed. But even as numbers fell, the shadow never lifted completely. Nuclear power spread to new nations. Some saw it as a guarantee of security, others as a symbol of fear. The same technology that could light cities could also erase them. The atom remained both promise and threat, a mirror of the human heart, capable of creation and destruction in the same breath. Today, Hiroshima stands as a city of peace. Its streets are alive with children, its skyline rebuilt, its rivers calm. Near the center of the city, the atomic bomb dome remains untouched, the shattered bones of a building that once stood at ground zero. Around it, the Peace Memorial Park stretches out in quiet symmetry. Visitors walk slowly, reading the names of the dead etched into stone. The air is still, as if the earth itself remembers. Each year, as the bells toll at 8:15 a.m., the exact moment when the world changed, silence falls across the city. The people bow their heads. In that silence, there are no nations, no enemies, no sides, only memory, only humanity. The sound of the river carries the echoes of the past away, but the lesson remains, heavy and eternal. That knowledge without wisdom is peril. That power without compassion is ruin. The atomic age was not just the story of a weapon. It was the story of what it means to be human, to invent, to destroy, to regret, and to hope. It was a story of men who sought to end a war, and in doing so, revealed the darkness within their own brilliance. It was the story of a world forced to see its own reflection in the blinding light of its creation. As the years pass, the survivors grow fewer. Their voices fade, but their message endures. In classrooms and museums, in films and in silence, their stories are told again and again, not to reopen old wounds, but to keep the world awake. Because the greatest danger is not the bomb itself, but forgetting that it was ever used. And so, the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains, not as a monument to despair, but as a warning carved into the conscience of the world. Beneath every city skyline, beneath every stretch of open sky, that memory waits, whispering the same quiet plea, that what happened once must never happen again.